Hey everybody, this is Kevin from the.wars.com, your resident debunker and nutrition science person. I'm now going to be talking about an interesting tweet by none other than Gary Taubes, the author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, the notorious and anti-establishment genius who essentially propagated the modern version of low-carb, I would say pseudoscientific theory. And I think many scientists would agree with me on this. He is responsible for the carbohydrate insulin model, which is the model of obesity endorsed by Ludwig and colleagues, and still a contentious topic in academic circles and in the journals currently, actually quite heated. But in this particular case, we're going to be following up on a tweet that he made about time-restricted eating, because there was a new trial that came out, and as you guys can see in the screen, hopefully the screen capture is working so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. A new trial came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, a trial out of China with about, I think it says 139 participants over the course of 12 months, showing that time-restricted eating added nothing onto simple calorie restriction. So you had two groups, both of them underwent calorie restriction, chronic calorie restriction, to eat, in this case, 15 to 1,800 calories per day for men and 12 to 1,500 calories per day for women. And then, additionally, one of those groups that was already calorie restricting was assigned to do time-restricted eating. And what the trial clearly showed was that there's no benefit, no additional benefit over simple calorie restriction to time-restricted eating. So you can see daily calorie restriction and time-restricted eating, they're both going down at a very similar rate, and this is in terms of kilograms. So at a given time, say 1 month, there's maybe a half kilogram or less difference between the daily calorie restricted group and the time restricted eating group, and by the time we get to about 6 months, they are neck and neck in terms of their total change in body weight. And so what Gary says is, he says, well, here's another way to think of it, because what Ethan made a tweet, and he says, interesting ideas for experiments in a different life would be great to discuss. Alas, I've moved on. I'm not going to go back to what the discussion was between Gary and Ethan, because it's just, the history is not that important. But I'm going to go talk about Gary's response in particular, which is quite interesting and can serve as a launch pad to discuss this issue of, in particular, this idea that it worked for me. It worked for me. I'm one of the people who responds to this intervention. Therefore, there might be some validity in it. And what I'm going to say in this video is that it worked for me isn't necessarily true. Just because you think something worked for you doesn't mean it actually worked for you. And this is a really fascinating topic and a really exciting thing for me to be talking about with you guys, because this is so often missed and it's so interesting and important to understand. So here's what Gary says. He says, here's another way to think about it. Clearly, time-restricted eating works for some, or they wouldn't keep doing it. Keep that in mind. It works for some, or they wouldn't keep doing it. My bias, it worked for me. I tried it as an experiment and lost 12 pounds I didn't think I had to lose. The question is why? Was I deluded? Always a possibility. I would say for him, it's definitely always a possibility, but let's focus on, in particular, this idea of clearly time-restricted eating works for some, or they wouldn't keep doing it. What does that mean? Okay, so if you go back to the Hippocratics, one of the things that they advocated was bleeding. Whenever a patient got sick with an acute illness, you bled the patients out. You were getting rid of the bad humors in the blood. The bad humors in the blood were responsible for the chronic illness, and therefore, if you bled those bad humors out, you'd improve the acute illness. And in this case, we're talking about infections, usually like food poisoning, like infections that progress to a serious point where you're about to die, etc. they would bleed patients to get rid of those bad humors causing that illness. And they did this for 2,000 years. Well, is the explanation for why they did that for 2,000 years that it worked for them, so therefore that's why they were doing it? Not necessarily, because in the 18th century, there was a scientist, I can't remember off the top of my head. I can look it up. Let's look it up real quick. There's a scientist by the name of Alexander Lasassier Hamilton. Okay? And there was a bloodletting trial by Hamilton. There's still some controversy about what the bloodletting trial actually did, but it ended up showing, this bloodletting trial by Alexander Lasassier Hamilton ended up showing that the people who were bled died at a higher rate than the people who are not bled. And we don't use this treatment anymore for people with acute illness. We don't bleed people with sepsis in the hospital. We don't try to make sure we get rid of all their blood or get rid of some of their blood or their humors in order to treat the illness. We know that's ridiculous, and one of the reasons is that there's actually good things and important things in the blood that you're bleeding out. And you're actually adding stress to the system whenever they're trying to fight off the illness, and it's actually going to hurt them. And there's some controversy, but or it's not even a controversy. It's quite clear that in the case of George Washington, he actually got an illness, and they bled, I think, something like a quarter of his blood, or maybe even like half of his blood volume. It was a tremendous amount of blood that they took away from George Washington in his final day, and that probably is thought to have probably contributed to his death. This aggressive bloodletting. Even at the time, there was great controversy about this and a big scandal related to his death. So, what's the point here? The point is that whenever somebody uses something because they think it might work, it doesn't necessarily mean that it does work. Just because you think it works, you see people get better when you bloodlet them, because I'm sure a lot of people who were bloodlet got better, some of them maybe in dramatic ways. Right? Some of people who they got over the illness in a dramatic way, that instilled this sense in the doctor, oh, bloodletting works. Just because you think something works on the basis of your experience doesn't actually necessarily mean that it actually works. It could totally not work statistically, like on average, like it's overwhelmingly killing patients. But you think, because of your bias, because of your confirmation bias, because the Hippocratic said it, because it makes sense to you, you think that you take these small subset of patients who got dramatically better, and you think that it therefore works. It may not actually ever work in any case, and it may always be detrimental, but just some people get better despite the treatment. Even though you think there's some variation and some people are getting dramatically better, those are the responders, whereas everybody else is a non-responder. That may not be the case at all. And it's also important to note that average effects are important, because if we're talking about things that we're going to apply to everybody, right? The average effect is important, because if everybody's going to start doing X, Y, or Z, if we know the average effect, we know the average impact, the average outcome on the population if you give a population level recommendation. And if something doesn't have a good average outcome, then recommending it to a large number of people is not going to be helpful. It's actually going to be harmful, because it's going to have an outcome that's negative on average, even if a certain small subsection of people respond. So if you can't identify what those people are who do respond, if there are real responders, and it's not just by chance, if you can't identify who those people are, you're in deep shit. You're in deep shit, because you're going to be giving you're going to be giving that recommendation out. There's going to be some people who might respond better, but then on average people do worse. Overall, the net harm is net harmful. It's net harmful, despite the fact that some people do better. So average effects also matter. But this is just the beginning of this. So just because time-restricted eating works for some, or they wouldn't keep doing it, time-restricted eating doesn't necessarily work for some. Just because they see a positive effect doesn't mean it works. And let's really hit this home by looking at a trial that investigated effects that show something like this. Look at this. This is really great. This is very important. Here's a study by Dylan Lowe and colleagues, where they compared consistent meal timing versus time-restricted eating. So they didn't just say, okay, we're going to compare time-restricted eating to doing nothing. We're going to compare time-restricted eating to if You're going to make sure you eat at this time, and this time. You're going to have consistent meal timing. Eat whatever you want, but you're going to have consistent meal timing, and it's not going to be in a restricted window, but we're just going to have consistent meal timing. That's it. Just pay attention to when you eat compared to time-restricted eating, where you shorten your eating window from, I think, in this case, noon to 8 o'clock p.m. That's your shortened eating window versus just pay attention to when you're eating, okay? And the eating window for when you're paying attention to eating, I think it was like 12 or I think it was just a normal eating window. It was substantially longer. I don't even know if it necessarily had an eating window, but you're just paying attention to when you're actually eating. Okay, so why is this important? Because in this case, that control group of paying attention to when you're eating is it's matching in the time-restricted eating group, it's matching simply paying attention to how you're eating, paying attention to your food. So since you're paying attention to your food when you're time-restricted eating, we want to make sure it's just not maybe just the fact that you're paying attention to how you're eating and when you're eating that's causing the effect. Is it actually the shortened eating window, or is it the fact that you're paying attention to when you're eating? And this trial, interestingly, showed that when you just give people consistent meal timing, they lose weight. In fact, they lose the same amount of weight as people who get time-restricted eating on average, showing there's no additional average effect. There's no additional average effect to time-restricted eating, to having a shortened eating window versus just paying attention to when you're eating, just being mindful. Suggesting that time-restricted eating works by just making people more mindful of when they're eating and how much they're eating. That's all that it does. You're just focusing on something. You're ritualistically focusing on, I'm eating in this certain window. I'm trying to lose weight. And that's the effect that you're seeing when you see time-restricted eating. It's not actually the shortened eating window. That's what this control group, that's what's so brilliant about this study. And if you don't have that for yourself, so if Gary's never done this consistent meal timing versus time-restricted eating, he doesn't actually know if time-restricted eating is actually helping him. He doesn't know if it's actually working for him. He has no idea. He lost 12 pounds, but it may have nothing to do with the shortened eating window. It just may have to do with the fact that he started focusing on when he was eating. That's it. That's what this study showed on average is the case. On average. Now, maybe some people respond better, right, than others. And to really address this, let's look at this really interesting figure in this paper. Here's this interesting figure, and then these are the bottom two graphs. Although you can see the weight measurements, you can see there's no difference, and you can see the adherence. Time-restricted eating is actually harder to adhere to. Even though there is no difference in weight loss, okay, it was also harder to adhere to. More people dropped out, more people didn't want to do it. Okay, but that aside, we're going to look at the waterfall. It's called a waterfall plot. And you see these individual participants along the x-axis, and along the y-axis you see percentage weight change. You see the distribution of percentage weight change versus each person. So each person is one of these bars, and that's how much percentage weight change that they had. You see a very similar distribution for each. But interestingly, you actually see more people who are losing weight, more weight, on time-restricted eating on the extreme end. There's like 4 or 5 people who are just destroying the time-restricted eating group. If you compare like at the extreme end, there's like 4 or 5 people in this cluster that are destroying the time-restricted eating group. And then there's a few more people, like again, 3 or 4 more people on the consistent meal timing group who are gaining weight. Okay? And so one of the things you could say is like, okay, maybe these waterfall plots indicate individual differences in response to the intervention. But this is actually not the correct interpretation. It's not the case that some people gained weight on consistent meal timing because of consistent meal timing. And some people gained weight on time-restricted eating because of time-restricted eating. Why? Why am I saying that? There are things going on in people's lives that are not controlled by the study that are affecting their weight loss outcomes here. So these people at the extreme end of consistent meal timing and time-restricted eating, they just may have a very favorable food environment, a very favorable situation where they're able to adhere to the intervention much more, they're able to focus on creating a calorie deficit much more, et cetera, et cetera. And then maybe these people, they change their jobs, they have less time to focus on eating food, et cetera, so they ended up gaining weight. So there's factors outside of the intervention itself that may be influencing the response to the people who are assigned to the intervention. They have nothing to do with the intervention. This variation is not biological variability. It may just be, and a lot of it definitely is, simply factors that are not controlled for by the design of the study, because this is a free living study. People weren't in a metabolic ward. People were living out their lives, given instruction, living out their lives, going to their jobs, et cetera, and seeing a wide variation in outcomes. Much of this variation is not accounted for by the time restricted eating. It's accounted for by these other factors going on in their lives. Okay, and in the case of Gary Taubes, right? Go back to Gary's tweet. He says, "It worked for me." How does he know it worked for him? Maybe there are other factors going on in his life that facilitated his adhering to the intervention and thereby losing the weight, but these weren't actually caused by the intervention itself. The intervention itself wasn't the thing that's driving much of his weight loss. It was just he had a lucky point in his life where he was able to change. He was able to make the change, so he's able to adhere to it and able to lose that weight, right? It may have nothing to do whatsoever with the intervention itself, just something favorable. But then he confuses these favorable conditions in his life for the efficacy of the intervention. And we don't know without knowing more about his particular situation. But interestingly, we do have interviews of people who have been involved in these kinds of studies who can talk about that. Let's go look at this. This is really interesting. So here's another study actually funded by the organization that Gary founded. It was published in 2018. It's called Diet Fits. The principal investigator was Chris Gardner, okay? It says Stanford, this is a great study. They did basically assign two groups, one group to a low-fat diet, one group to a high-fat diet. So low-fat versus low-carb, basically. Low-fat versus low-carb diet. Free living, just like the previous study. And in addition to that, they were given advice not to eat refined, sugary foods, sugary beverages, etc. So it's a healthy low-fat diet versus a healthy low-carb diet. Cool. What did they find? They found, we got to actually go to the supplement here because the relevant material is in supplement 2. But I'll give you a teaser. We found no difference in average weight loss. But we did find quite a lot of variation. And what is this variation? Let's look. We have waterfall plots here, right here. Page 17. E figure 1. Healthy low fat versus healthy low carb. You look at these two waterfall plots here. Right? You look at these two waterfall plots. They're virtually identical. There's overall weight change, positive weight change. This is probably caused by the fact that A, people are dieting, they're focusing on what they're eating, they're focusing on losing weight, and B, they're focusing on eating healthy as opposed to eating unhealthy. Okay, so overall, the people are losing weight. Let's see if we can duplicate this tab, so we can keep this tab. Duplicate the tab. Okay, overall, people are losing weight, and it was an average in this case of 5.3 kilograms, so about 12 pounds, 13 pounds, low fat diet, and 6 kilograms for the low carb diet, so 13 or 14 pounds. And there's no statistical difference. It was virtually identical in terms of the weight loss. Virtually identical at 1 year. Same number of people who dropped out from each group. It was a beautiful symmetrical dropout rate. And it was 609 participants, so it was a very large study. Okay? So, but the interesting thing is you had a wide variation. I'm going to go to 17 again. You had a wide variation in the response. Now, what does that do to? There was a follow-up investigation by journalist Julia Blues for Vox, where she said, okay, why did some people succeed and why did some people fail in this study? And she says, why do dieters succeed or fail? The answers have little to do with food. We asked participants in a big study about being on a low-fat or low-carb diet. The responses surprised us. And this is a beautiful bit of journalism. There's only 4 people that they interviewed, but this provides some really interesting qualitative information about why people succeeded or failed. And so, number one of her her explanation. Your job can make it harder or easier to lose weight. I'm just quoting from her. At the beginning of the study, Todd Moore weighed 269 pounds, a big guy, okay? After a year on the low-carb diet, he lost 58 pounds, making him an outlier and an incredible success. When I asked him what contributed to all the weight loss, his answer was surprising. It was, in fact, a change of job, a big shift in daily patterns that came with it. Todd had been working as an electrical technician for a medical company in the Bay Area when he heard about Diet Fits in 2014. His role involved a lot of manual labor, rolling around on the floor, working to repair CT scanners or x-ray machines, and he felt his weight was often getting in the way. He was also driving a lot in between appointments in hospitals, often turning to burger joints or Taco Bell for fast and convenient food. I'd eat to get something in my body and go to the next spot so I could work, said the 47-year-old father of three. It was rushed and hurried, but not too much thought was going into what I was putting in my body. Joining this study was really life-changing for me, he said. Weight had been a problem since his childhood, but he managed to finally get to a body size he's comfortable with, and he's kept off the extra pounds to this day. One of the major reasons for his success, he went from working in the field at hospitals and spending much of his day on the road to doing IT support from an office only 2 miles from his house. It helped with preparing my meals and staying focused. I had more time throughout the day when I'm not driving, he said. That meant more time to exercise and to shop for healthier items at the grocery store. These days, he's no longer eating low carb, but he follows a plant-based diet. There are determining factors in our lives making us eat the way we do, he said. And so he advises would-be dieters to reflect on how their jobs may be nudging them in unhealthy directions. Okay, it's really important to comment on this because the other three stories in this article are very similar, but it's really important to comment on this one critical thing here. He's kept the weight off, right? He started with a low-carb diet. He's kept the weight off, but he switched to a plant-based diet. It's not even a low-carb diet. He switched to a plant-based diet. It's a completely different diet, and he's kept the weight off. Why? Because his job changed. His job changed. Now, it would be very easy for somebody to misinterpret their experience with the diet if they're not thinking very carefully as the result of being low carb rather than having a change in job. People do this. People mistake radical changes in their lives as being the result of the diet, especially when they have books to sell. I'm not saying anything, but especially if they have books to sell, and they have a reason for wanting to tell this story, right? In this case, he said, hey, look, it's part of my job that changed all this stuff. I switched to a completely different diet. I kept the weight off. Even though I switched to a completely different diet. So, when you look at this waterfall plot, there are a lot of people just like him who had life changes that changed their response to the diet. It had nothing to do with the diet itself. This variability, much of this variability here, has nothing to do with biology. This isn't a biological variability. This is not a biological variability. This is a lifestyle, life circumstances variability. It's not due to the intervention itself. It's due to variation in lifestyle. That's part of the reason why these distributions look so similar. Because the distribution of lifestyle variables and things that confound weight loss and confound weight gain are evenly distributed between the groups. Therefore, you see an even distribution of outcomes between the groups in terms of the skew here in the waterfall. That's one way to interpret it. And I think that is the correct way of interpreting this. Now, we can go back to Ethan's study. And I think this is just so important to keep looking at. You see a very similar distribution in the consistent meal timing versus the time restricted eating group in terms of the waterfall plot, suggesting that's actually lifestyle factors, circumstances that are responsible for the differences in response to the interventions. It's not actually differences in response to the interventions. It's simply differences in outcome with each person by chance being in each intervention. Meaning the differences in weight loss or weight gain between people in an intervention are not driven by differences in biology. They're driven by differences in circumstances. And here's some really good data to suggest that might be true. So there's another study published in 2021, last year, in Nature Medicine by Kevin Hall. He's a principal investigator. Okay? This study was called Effect of a Plant-Based Low-Fat Diet versus an Animal-Based Ketogenic Diet on an Ad Libitum Energy Intake. And, okay, we got to make sure to click the link here and get you guys this. Now, here's the figure that becomes interesting for Kevin Hall's study. And this is going to be a figure 2. You see this low carb versus low fat diet? You see this is the energy intake on each diet, and the low carb diet is on the left, and the low fat diet is on the right. But you see a very consistent decrease in energy intake. There's some small variability in how much of a drop in energy intake there is in each person, so there's a different slope. But it's strikingly similar between participants. Why? This is not a free living study. So why is it so consistent? It's because it's not a free living study. It's because this is in a metabolic ward. So each person is given the same meals, is living the same circumstances, is having on the same schedule, is instructed, and like all their activity is controlled. It's like you're not allowed to go run on a treadmill, you're not allowed to do exercise. I think they had some like they were actually like it was mandatory to do some like consistent exercise, like 30 minutes a day, in order to make it consistent between participants. So each person did like 30 minutes of moderate exercise per day. But the exercise was standardized between participants. I'm not sure if it was actually 30 minutes. It might be like no exercise allowed, but everybody had to do the same thing because everybody's lives are being controlled. And when everybody's lives are being controlled, and they're all told to do the same thing, and nobody has to work, nobody's having strange hours, nobody having differences in their lifestyle, the outcome is the same. The outcome's the same. What does that mean? It means that here, this strongly suggests that differences in response to low carb versus low fat diets are not driven by biological differences. They're driven by circumstantial environmental differences. This variation in these studies, in these waterfall plots, is not driven. It's not driven by the intervention, but differences in response to the intervention themselves. It's driven in differences in the environment. And it may be the case that if you think you're a low carb person, you got a good benefit from low carb. If you switch to a low fat diet and you kept the same life circumstances, you'd have a similar effect. Here in this particular study, in these particular meals, it's not quite that way because actually here the low carb diet seemed to do worse than the low fat diet. But so in this case, it's not true. But in other paradigms, okay, cool. I hope that makes sense because it's really important. And so we get around to the next study, and we get around to we're going to talk about one of Huberman's responses as well. The next study was in the New England Journal of Medicine. That was the study that we talked about with respect to Gary Taubes. And here's the interesting thing: the waterfall plot, same phenomenon, same phenomenon. Even though there were there's no difference between the groups. The waterfall plot here is evenly distributed between the two groups, with maybe a little bit extra weight loss because it's not statistically significant, but there's like a modest increase in weight loss. Like it's and statisticians wouldn't call this a real decrease in weight loss. I think the difference was 1.7 kilograms, is on the order of like 3 pounds or 4 pounds of difference of change of body weight because. So 1.8 kilograms, but it's not a statistically significant difference. So it could have just been due to chance. There's a substantial probability that it was due to chance, meaning that if there is a difference between the two interventions, like if you had more participants, this difference would be so small as to be not clinically significant. So adding time-restricted eating onto chronic calorie restriction results in a non-clinically significant increase in weight loss, at best. And that's not even the interpretation most scientists would endorse. Most scientists would not endorse that interpretation. That's the interpretation I'm giving. It seems probable that there's a slight benefit but it's not an important one. Okay, but with that said, we have a very similar, almost equivalent distribution in outcomes. Meaning, it's probable that this distribution in outcomes is not due to the intervention itself, but due to circumstances in people's lives that influence the way that they seem to respond to the intervention, but they're actually just varying in weight due to external factors, okay? So whenever it comes to it worked for me, it may not necessarily have worked for you unless you actually did a controlled study where you compared it to consistent meal timing, when you compared it to, when you did a crossover study where you tried for 2 months one way, 2 months another way, 2 months one way, 2 months the other way. It's an ABAB, N of 1 crossover study. It's a scientific study. People actually do those sorts of things and publish them. It's just nobody actually does those, and certainly Gary hasn't. Gary doesn't. Gary finds things that he likes and sticks to them, and then he claims that those work for him. But he's a critical science journalist. That's like what he calls himself. He calls himself a critical science journalist. Here's the thing. He should know better. He should know better than to say that because it works for him, quote unquote, it works, that it necessarily works. That's why we have science. We have science in order to test whether actually things work for you according to your experience and whether that's real. Because we also think there's the, it's obvious that the sun goes around in the sky, so clearly the sun is going around the earth, right? It's clear. You look at it, my direct experience says that, but when you use science to actually test that and figure out what's going on, it's actually not the sun that's circling the earth that's circling the sun. It's an illusion. And in a similar sort of way, you can have an illusion about your diet anecdotes. And Gary knows this. He knows this better than anybody. He knows it. But he's giving in to his bias. He's giving into this bias. I'll talk about my own anecdote, right? My own anecdote. Is my keyboard dead? No, it's not. It's just the computer's slow. So I said, when I practiced calorie restriction and intermittent fasting, I was convinced that it felt amazing. But looking back, this was one of the more miserable periods in my life. I don't say most miserable, although it is on the level. There's a little bit more miserable periods in my life, but it's on a level there because I was so irritable. I was so irritable and argumentative and terrible. And I wasn't a happy person. I thought I was. I was amped up. I was amped up on stress hormones and norepinephrine and stuff because I wasn't eating. So my body was amping up my stress hormones. And I was amped up, but that doesn't mean I was happy. I was not happy. And I was a miserable person. And I said, anecdotes can be misleading. I don't even trust my own. And that's all I'm saying with this video is don't trust your own anecdotes. Don't trust your own anecdotes. That's all I'm saying, which is a crazy thing to say. It's but don't trust them because they're not reliable. Your anecdote is not reliable. It's not even reliable to you. Now, do what works for you. I'm not going to tell you not to do what works for you. I'm not going to tell you not to do what's your preference, if it's your preference. But always question whether what works for you, what's your preference, etc., is really what is the truth. Because there's so many different ways it could not be the truth. That's why we have science. Because direct experience doesn't answer what's actually the truth. There's so many different ways that direct experience can be confounded and misleading that we need scientific, rigorous investigation to determine whether or not these stories are actually true. So Gary Taubes is a critical science journalist. He's a critical science journalist, right? But he doesn't understand the basics of science. He doesn't understand. Was I deluded? Always a possibility. Why does he promote his idea and then say, well, I could be deluded? Look, I don't promote my idea if I say I could be deluded, although sometimes I do. Sometimes I'll say something I believe something, I could be wrong, we need to look at it more. Like taurine, for example, taurine and sleep and taurine and stress. It's one of those things I believe is the case, but I don't actually know. But it is supported by a lot of basic science, but we still need to test it, right? In this case, he thinks that he actually had a variable response to time-restricted eating. He's actually kind of an outlier. But that actually might not be the interpretation. That is the take-home message of this video. That may not be the interpretation. That may be absolutely wrong. His interpretation may be wrong, completely wrong. And it just happened to be the case that he lost weight at that particular point in his life. and then if he goes back to non-time restricted eating and just pays attention to his meal timing a little bit better, he'll be just as well. He'll be doing just as well. Or if he goes off time restricted eating and tries some other sort of intervention like plant-based diet or something that like kind of strengthens the degree to which he's restricted, he might do just as well as time restricted eating. It may have nothing to do with the feeding window itself, just may have to do with the fact that he's focusing on restriction. Okay? So, take-home messages. Those are some of the take-home messages. Although I want to go back because it's really important. It's really important to just show just how like clueless people are. This is a guy who's a professor of neurobiology at Stanford School of Medicine, and he's making the same mistakes. Oh my God. He says the NEJM paper on intermittent fasting is important. Rather than use the press conclusions of no benefit, however, it would be wise to read the author's own words that the 2 weight loss regimens that we evaluated had similar success in patients with obesity. You choose. I don't think he read the study. I don't think Huberman read I don't think he read this study. He's not a nutrition expert. He's not a metabolism expert. I think he just literally made something up. What the study very clearly shows is that it's it's calorie restriction versus calorie restriction plus time restricted eating. Time restricted eating found no additional benefit over calorie restriction. That's what it showed. That's what people are saying, no benefit. Yeah, you can choose between calorie restriction and calorie restriction plus time restricted eating, sure. But why would you? Why not just choose calorie restriction if you're going to add something else to the top of it? Why? Why are you going to eat in an 8-hour window instead of just eating it normally? Why, if there's no extra benefit? So I don't think he read the study. And that's like the final take home I want to point out here. It's like, it's hilarious. This commentary on this study is ridiculous. It's like, you choose. What do you mean you choose? Like, look, the average difference is that there's no average difference. Why choose? Anyway, and it's funny because Huberman is one of the ones who keeps saying that his anecdotes about time restricted eating, blah, 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 he's a responder. How do you know he's a responder? It may just be his life circumstances that made him believe he's a responder, but he's actually confounded by all sorts of different things that have nothing to do with the intervention itself. How does he know? Has he ever done a crossover study on himself, looking at consistent meal timing versus time restricted eating, and shown that the feeding window itself is actually responsible for the phenotype, for the benefit that he sees, rather than just paying attention to his food? Has he ever thought about these things? I don't think he's ever thought about these things. And yet he pontificates on them. He's a serious scientist in neurobiology at the Stanford School of Medicine. But on Twitter, I'm trying to find a nice way to say this. On Twitter, he's full of nonsense. And this is not his field. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And he needs to stop talking about it. Because this is complicated, as we've seen in this video. And I hope you guys have drawn some really important lessons from this. Be more skeptical of your own anecdotes. Now, follow them for sure. If you find a certain way of doing things that works for you, and then you try the old way again, and you're being thoughtful about it, and it just still works for you, yeah, I'm not going to tell you to do something that the data don't support it, therefore don't do it. No, I'm never going to say that. If it works for you, do it. If it's your preference, do it. Right? But just note that sometimes it is about it being your preference, or it's about it being your circumstances. And later on in life, you can change. You can try something else, and something else will work also. That wouldn't have worked then, but then maybe works later on because of certain things you don't understand, or we don't understand about biology or your circumstances or whatever. So be open to changing, because what works for you may not always work for you. Be open to the possibility that you're wrong. Because when you're open to the possibility that you're wrong while still pursuing the thing that you're doing and still using the tools that you have, but you're open to being wrong, you're open to optimizing further, then you're going to keep going up that ladder. You're going to keep spiraling upward because you're going to keep learning new things, and you're going to keep optimizing and adding things to your life and making good decisions. Not becoming ossified in one particular paradigm. And then you have more options, more freedom to do the things that you need to do and to be flexible in response to life circumstances. And you have more tools in the toolbox when you're open to being wrong and you're curious. And that's really the theme of this, of my YouTube channel, of my podcast, of my social media presence. That's the theme. It's like we're always capable of being wrong, and always, about everything. We should always be open to that possibility and trying to be wrong, trying to show that we are wrong, being excited about being wrong, because that's where learning is. If we can find where we're wrong, we can find where we can learn something new. That's the beauty of being intellectually honest and scientific. If we are looking for where we're wrong, we're looking to learn something new that's going to help us. That's power. Being open to being wrong is powerful in a practical way in everyday life. It's power. That's strength. That's efficacy. That's effectiveness in your everyday life. Being open to being wrong. And I'll leave you guys with that. Check out the YouTube channel, Kevin Bass. I think the link you could find it is KBass Philadelphia. Check out the podcast, The Kevin Bass Show. Check out Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Kevin in Bass, KevinnNbass. That's 2 N's. Check out my Patreon if you want to help support me. KevinnNbass. Again, 2 N's, Kevin in Bass. I talk to some of you guys for 30 to 45 minutes a month. Those are the highest tier patrons. Please sign up for that if you want to talk with me on the phone for 30 to 45 minutes a month. We can talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. All right? Otherwise, send me questions if you're one of my patrons and you're curious about some of the things I'm talking about. Send me questions. Try to send me like 1 or 2 questions a month. Don't send me a big, long book. Send me a few short things so I can get to everybody. Make sure to mention, hey, I'm a patron of yours. I've donated to you. I want to talk about this stuff so that I can know to prioritize your stuff. Go to my website, thedietwars.com. You can also support me directly through a direct donation, thedietwars.com/support-me. And what else did I miss? Yeah, like this video, share it widely, comment, let me know what you think about it, and subscribe. Subscribe to this podcast, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Like, let people know about this podcast, because I think the highest review that's ranked up there says I sound like I'm on speed. It sounds like I've snorted a bunch of coke. I stammer and mutter, and it's like my mouth is full of marbles, and it's like the worst thing they've ever heard in their life. So if we can get some other reviews to say that I'm not that bad, and hopefully I'm not that bad, then that would be great, because we need to pump this up and rock this stuff. Get this stuff out there. So I hope you guys appreciated this. We're going to do some more videos on this kind of material and this kind of content. I'm going to go do some like more Huberman was wrong videos, because everybody loves that. Seems like it's like jet fuel for my social media accounts. Everybody likes to know where Huberman was wrong, because I think a lot of people sense it, but a lot of people are afraid to say it, because he's like a Stanford neurobiology professor. Like, nobody wants to say it, and they're like, oh, but I know it's true. So then, like, whenever somebody says it and starts saying it, like, yeah, they're retweeting it, they're sharing it on Facebook. So it's like blowing up my social media a lot, so I'm going to make more of these things. And then we'll get back to some of the vegan stuff, because I think that's super important. That's part of my long-term goals as well. But so is this misinformation. So it's all part of a big vision for me that I have going forward, and it'll make a lot more sense as we move forward. And hopefully you guys will enjoy all of that. So I hope you liked all this. Let me know what you think about it. Check out the next podcast/video when it comes out. Peace.